You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
Hello and welcome to Proof Text. I am Michael Halcomb, and also welcome to Glossa House TV. I'm Michael Halcomb, and today I have the privilege of chatting with newly minted author Caleb Lewis. Caleb, it's good to see you. Good to meet you in person, virtually, anyways. We've talked on the phone before, but yeah, it's good to see you. Is this your first book that's just come out?
It is, yeah. And yeah, great to be here. Thanks for having me on. It's great talking to you face to face finally. But yeah, this is my first book that's come out. Was the result of just a lot of rereading Genesis. So that's where this has come from, really.
I'm gonna, as we're talking here, I'm gonna put your book up here on the screen so folks can see it. It's currently available at whipandstock.com. It's called Through the Waters, a Biblical Theology of the Book of Genesis. And that's what a bit of what we're going to be talking about today. Now, most people wouldn't expect a scene of the splitting of the Red Sea, at least that's what it looks like, on the cover of a book about Genesis. Or Through the Waters is an interesting title for the book of Genesis. So we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on there, but if you go to this website, you can preview the title and get a description and so congrats on the book, Caleb.
Awesome, yeah.
By the way, Caleb and his friend and I believe pastor Nate Young, is that his name, Nate Young?
Yeah, Nate Young.
I'm still making sure I get the names right. They've just come on to the Proof Text Glossa House team, and they run the Bible in Context segment, the Bible in Context podcast that we air on these channels. So we're really stoked to have you and Nate working with us, and you can see their pictures on our Glossa House TV banner on YouTube. So
we're happy to be a part of it.
And if you listen into that Bible in Context podcast segment, what you're doing on there too is going through Genesis.
Yeah, at the moment the podcast is actually born out of the book a little bit. This project started well before the podcast, and at the same time, Nate started preaching through Genesis. So I thought, well, we've got some fresh thoughts and good resources. So we are stepping through Genesis. We're also addressing a lot more, side issues, just a lot more conversational things, and other theological topics that are outside of the scope of the book. So it's been a really fun podcast to go through and to step through books of the Bible, and then just tackle some really difficult theological issues as well that we've gotten to have some questions on. So it's been good. And yeah, I like that you mentioned the cover there. I actually don't know the cover designer. A guy named is Mike Serber, it says, but I don't know if you read the book or not, but the cover makes me think that he did and paid a good amount of attention. So I really like how the cover came out.
Yeah, so as I started to dig into the book, you're making the case even sort of early on that there are a couple of really prominent motifs that are found in Genesis. Now, what's really interesting to me is, you're so I'll come back to that. This is sort of coming off that, and I think you're right about this, that the Exodus, right, that as a motif or a theme has really enjoyed sort of a renaissance in biblical studies in the last decade or two, especially in New Testament studies. And a lot of that, I think, was maybe owed to N.T. Wright, who has really talked about sort of the Exodus as the sort of foundational national event in Israel's history, and the big role that plays in the Gospels and Jesus' own thoughts. And we have to understand the Exodus for understanding what the Gospels are saying in Jesus' ministry. So the Exodus is sort of read forward from Exodus on up through the New Testament, but is never really, Genesis is never really read in light of Exodus, or Exodus never really read backward in a way. And so you're picking up on the Exodus theme and then what you call the two goats theme. So let's start with the two goats. That's interesting. I don't know that everybody's going to know what the two goats motif is in Scripture. So say a little bit about that.
Yeah, and honestly, I made that title up myself because no one has done a deep dive into this as a motif through Genesis. There is a few scholars out there who have noticed this, even rabbis throughout history have noticed this pattern, but it's never been talked about as a motif that runs through the book of Genesis. And I'll talk about why I call it the two goats motif. For better or for worse, that's what I called it. But I really wanted that to remind the reader of the two goats of the Day of Atonement, because that is what this motif really climaxes in. So first, I'll say a couple things about the Day of Atonement for those who just aren't familiar with that text, at least off the top of their head. So at the Day of Atonement, you have two goats, which are elected by Yahweh. You cast lots and pick two goats. One is for Yahweh. It is sacrificed as a sin offering, and its blood is brought into the tabernacle to cleanse the camp of Israel. The other goat is then has the sins of Israel laid on it, and it is cast out of the camp into the wilderness, bearing the sins of Israel. Now, you see some of those elements show up with the pairs of brothers that go throughout the book of Genesis. And so as you read through Genesis, you'll see there's a younger brother who is chosen or elected as the firstborn, and he bears the promises of the seed of the woman. Then you have the older brother. He acts with some sort of jealousy towards the elect, and the older brother then does something usually horrible to the elect brother. He's given some form of protection from Yahweh as he is then exiled out into the wilderness, similar to the goat. The older brother is then multiplied into a nation, which is really unexpected and really cool. And then this nation who has been shown this grace by Yahweh eventually becomes hostile to God's people at some point throughout the biblical narrative. Meanwhile, the elect brother is brought closer into Yahweh's dwelling, Yahweh's land, something along those lines. He comes closer to the Lord. And then sometimes this brother is associated with a sin offering, which is really interesting. And there'll be some places throughout Genesis where these brothers are even more likened to the goats they compare to in Leviticus.
Excellent. So invoking that sort of Day of Atonement stuff. So yeah, that's an interesting insight that you're picking up on there. In relating the two goats to the pairs that we often encounter throughout the book of Genesis. Well, what about the Exodus? How do you see the Exodus motif appearing in Genesis? What is the Exodus motif?
Yeah, so I guess to boil it down to a few steps, the Exodus motif is that there's usually one who is elect, someone, say like Abraham or Abel, someone who bears that seed of the woman promise. So you have the same individual that the two goats and Exodus motifs center on. We'll talk about more how these motifs really work together to build to a climax at the end of Genesis. But this elect one is in a place of violence or oppressors, in some state of ruin, often in exile. And that sounds like the beginning of the Exodus story. So Yahweh sees or hears or knows of this distress somehow, and then the enemies are defeated or struck. The elect come out, often as a mixed multitude. They have other people that come out with them. They've gained all sorts of wealth and resources and servants while they were in their exile. And then there is an act of new creation that happens, whether literarily or actually. Then the elect is put into the dwelling of Yahweh, or brought closer to Yahweh, which again, we just mentioned that in the two goats motif. So again, you see how these might coincide. And then the elect is commissioned or blessed. They become a priest or are given the Edenic blessings or the Abrahamic blessings. And then there is often, sadly, some form of disloyalty to Yahweh that happens. There's a new fall that causes another exodus to need to happen.
So what got you into reading and studying Genesis?
Oh man. So ever since I've become a Christian, I've just really wanted to ask the next why. And in the New Testament, I start to see how everything goes back to the Old Testament. So, okay, I go back to the Old Testament. As I go back and start reading the Old Testament, well, everything leads back to Genesis. So I'm sure you may be familiar with the concept of typology, where a certain theme begins in the first few chapters of Genesis, and that theme continues on throughout the whole Bible until it climaxes in Jesus and then his final return. But the root of so much of that is in Genesis. So that really led me to understand, how do biblical authors, how do they write? How do they try to communicate? What themes are they playing on a lot? What's their culture like? And as you start to understand these things, you can better understand the meaning of Genesis, the kinds of tropes they want to use, and then it informs our worldview, how we see things around us, how we see ourselves, how we see God, and what is the final hope we're looking for.
Yeah. So you're in Kentucky, right? You're in Kentucky.
Right. As these lovely pictures behind me display.
My old stomping ground, yes, behind you, the pictures of Kentucky, the one of Kentucky and Tennessee. So you're there in sort of the Bible Belt, and you have the Creation Museum and my old hometown, Noah's Ark, that Ken Ham rebuilt there. So, I'm wondering, because I know you guys have been venturing to Genesis at your church, and sort of your podcast grew out of that. I'm wondering how. So let me rephrase it. In that area, there's a certain sort of ingrained way of approaching Genesis.
Yes.
And here you come, and you're saying, but wait, there's maybe some other angles to look at Genesis from, and I imagine that one, a lot of people have never heard that, and then two, that it might even make some people suspicious of you or what you're saying, or even uncomfortable. So I'm wondering, as you've engaged people on Genesis, what has been the response? Have you met that? Have you met that skepticism? And
I have
what's
not.
it been like?
Yeah, I've not encountered any pushback yet. That may come. Typically, when I'm looking through these motifs, I'm showing, here's the literary connections. Here's how the story works. Here's what the meaning of it is. And so there's such a grounding to what I'm trying to say when I try to display this in a more public setting. And then usually I'm showing such a biblically founded, or perhaps a meaning of the certain narrative section I'm going through, that really coincides with something you might hear elsewhere in the Bible. And so it really points us towards theology that we already believe. And so I think in that, a lot of people find comfort in what I'm saying and don't really take the time to push back. And typically in the book and in those contexts, I don't take the time to push back on perhaps some of the ministries that you just mentioned, which I've been to them both. Very, very cool. I don't agree with everything they have to say, but yeah, I don't take the time to push back on that. I'm sure if I pressed on that harder, I would receive more pushback.
Yeah. Have you, this is a side thing, have you been to the Creation Museum or the Ark?
Yeah, I actually haven't been to the Creation Museum since I was a teenager. I've been to the Ark a few times, and it's a monstrosity. It's pretty cool to see.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. So that Creation Museum was built, or was being built, probably around 2003, 4, 5, 6, somewhere in there. I was a full-time pastor while that was being built in Kentucky, and
oh, wow.
and I was also going to seminary at the time, and I remember getting an invitation from Ken Ham to come and tour the Creation Museum as it was being built. So
really,
I went there and spent a day with Ken Ham and had barbecue and toured this museum. It was pretty interesting to sort of see behind the scenes. Yeah, I think old Ken Ham, he gets hated on quite a bit in the biblical scholarship community through some fault of his own. He's been a bit cantankerous toward people and like some people, but I guess I'm not as I don't have as much animosity toward him as others in the field of biblical studies might have. But
yeah, and I might need to preface just with the fact that I used to be a full-on when I came into the faith, I was full-on Ken Ham. Full-on loved Ken Ham and Answers in Genesis and all that. I mean, I was very much looking towards Genesis and just seeing like, okay, this is a scientific document.
Right. Right.
Since I've come to read it more literarily and as an ancient Near Eastern text. And so I don't agree with that view necessarily anymore, but I respect it because I understand there's people who are trying to honor God and trying to make an apologetic for why we should trust the Bible. So I would love to have more conversations. Usually if I say like I'm not a creationist in the same sense as Answers in Genesis is, that it quickly becomes hostile. But I like those conversations to be friendly because I think we could learn from each other.
Yeah. I would still call myself a 6-day creationist, and a lot of people would balk at that. But at the same time, I read Genesis literarily and theologically rather than scientifically. So yeah, I mean, I would probably, in some sense, share a number of the same views that Ken Ham has. I used to, like I said, I went toward the museum and had lunch, and had, he gave us a bunch of his books and tracts when we were there. But yeah, I don't know. I find that for some reason, Genesis, especially Genesis 1, is such like a battleground, and rightly so for some reasons. I think it probably was in the ancient world too. Competing creation narratives, creation accounts, we might say. But yeah, I mean, I want to talk about your book, but I also just want to talk about Genesis in general.
I'm cool with that.
Yeah, so I'm curious how you approach Genesis 1. And I don't know if you deal with that directly in the book, but yeah, I'm curious. Do you tie the Exodus motif to that at all, or no?
Yeah, so there's actually a whole section on how the Exodus motif ties into creation. As far as the whole, is this literal or symbolic or something else? I don't touch that at all. I didn't want that to be a stumbling block for the purpose and the scope of this particular book. We would talk about it in the podcast. And we even preface that with like, look, if you disagree, people like to get militant over this. We don't like, if all of this is pointing us towards Christ, if we're all just trying to honor Jesus and to proclaim his name, we can disagree and we can be brothers and sisters. So we can disagree, but let's have a peaceful conversation about it. But yeah, the way I read those is that it fits in the category of ancient Near Eastern mythology. Not that it's necessarily a myth, but to say that the biblical authors are using the concepts and categories and stories that their neighbors knew and that the Israelites knew, so that whenever they say, instead of Marduk or Baal fighting the sea serpent and crushing it, Yahweh had no competitor. He just spoke and it happened.
Yeah. I've often, for a long time, I've held the position, and I don't know if there's anyone else that sort of holds this, and I'm not trying to be just unique or whatever, but I've referred to Genesis 1 as comedy.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Explain that to me. That's new to me.
Yeah. So, and if you Google like Michael Halcomb Genesis comedy, you probably find an old blog post I wrote on that. But, so I also say it's Hebrew poetry, but I also say it's historical. So it's like this historical poetic comedy. And on the one hand, then I would say for like the poetic comedy element, you can like look at something like Dr. Seuss, like the Cat in the Hat, which is like funny poetry, right? Except in this case, like the funny poetry is actually telling a true story, like a true historical story, whereas Cat in the Hat's just like kind of a nonsensical story.
Right.
So a lot of times, if you like, what are the little like 5-line poems that people often do?
A haiku?
Yeah, like haiku or something like that. Like people have these. There's another name. Yeah. Anyways, like historical poems, like funny poems that have a historical like sense to them. That's how I see Genesis 1. And
Sure.
so, as you just mentioned, like Marduk, right? Like there's certainly Hebrew poetic elements in Genesis 1. Like you have the alliteration, you have the rhyme, you have assonance, you have all sorts of these poetic elements going on in Genesis 1 that you just can't deny. And so in that sense, it's poetic. It's comedic in the sense that it's kind of making fun of other myths like the Marduk myth.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
I was wondering if you were going to say that turns the big sea serpent into a little plaything, into a rubber ducky.
Yeah, exactly. And so you have these comedic elements where it's like saying, yeah, it's kind of like that, creation myth over there, but different.
Right. Yahweh is utterly on top of it.
Different in the sense that it's true. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Different in the sense that our God really did it this way. Different in the sense that it's historical. So yeah, that's what I mean when I say it's like poetic comedy with a historical tense to it. Yeah. So I don't know. You can chew on that or push back or however you like, but I find Genesis 1 fascinating.
Yeah, no. I'm at the current place where when it comes to the historicity and timing and all those debates, I mostly just throw my hands up and say, I don't know. I don't know if the biblical author knew or cared. So if you think this way or that way, maybe you'll convince me. But I do not have a strong opinion on that. I'm more so looking at it's there's this Exodus going on. It's also being portrayed as like a temple building. And so the big point is like, Yahweh is coming down to dwell with humanity in his garden, in his temple, with his people, ruling alongside them. And I think there's so much richness in the first couple chapters that you can pull out of it without even touching the scientific debates or historic debates. Not that they're not important. They are, absolutely. But there's so much more there.
Yes. Yeah. I find it fascinating how it's such a battleground. And again, I get it because it's origin stories, right?
Right.
Yeah. So as far as your book goes, what would be like, maybe you think more of like a part that would catch people's attention and be like, oh, I never looked at it that way. Like, what's a familiar story that somebody, if they're reading your book, they might be like light bulb moment or aha.
Okay. Well, this is the first one to spring to mind. So first I'm going to give just a couple second background on the creation story and the Noah's flood story, and then we'll get to Abraham and talk about him for a second. So in the creation story, you have the waters which part and then the dry land appears. You see that same exact phrasing in the Exodus account. And that's one of the many steps of linking those two stories. You also have in Noah's flood, you have also the wind. I forgot to mention that there's the wind there as well, which is the same Hebrew word for spirit. So you have the ruach, the waters parting, and the dry land appearing. You have that same thing going on in Noah's flood. Well, whenever you get to Abraham being called out of Babylon into Canaan, or Haran, he comes into Canaan, and the word there, it says, go to the land that I will show you. Well, in Hebrew, it's the same root for the word appear. The dry land appears, because it's just to the passive of to make see. And so for Abraham, you also have go to the land that I will make appear to you. In some sense, like that root links it. So again, you have out of the chaos of Babylon, you have him coming to another land that is made to appear. And that's one of the many steps in Abraham's call into Canaan, that begins to portray this as like, this is a new, not only a new Exodus, as the land appears as it did in Exodus 14, but it's a new creation, just as it happened with the recreation in Noah's flood and the first creation story in Genesis 1 and 2. So,
right. Yeah. Excellent. You have this sort of water, land, water, spirit, or wind motif. You have it later in Joshua too, right? As they're crossing over the river
in Joshua
Jordan.
3, right?
Yeah. So that entire motif, and you see that also, I think, at the baptism of Jesus, in a sense, right? The land, the water, the spirit, in the parting of the heavens in this case. Interesting motif. Go ahead. Yeah.
I was going to say, I actually follow that at the conclusion of the book where I talk about, Joshua 3, there's no spirit in that with no ruach, but you still have the water stopping after a Passover, and it replays the Exodus intentionally. You do have some Exodus. I mean, Exodus is all through the Bible in the Old Testament of coming out of Babylon and Assyria and Persia. Then yes, Jesus, absolutely. That's meant to portray an Exodus and portray him as a new creation. And then that even follows into our own baptism. We're replaying that Exodus moment, that new creation moment, whenever we're baptized and profess faith in Christ.
Yes. I remember. So I was I've been preaching through the Gospel of Mark for a couple years, and as I was doing the baptismal scene, that I was dealing with that motif starting back in Genesis and then Exodus, Joshua, like tracing it through up until where you have that sort of land, water, motif, spirit, parting motif. Really cool motif that you find throughout the scripture. Do you deal with Abraham taking Isaac up onto the mountain at all?
I do.
In the book?
Yeah, so that is one of those places where Isaac is actually associated pretty clearly with an offering. Hopefully you get that at least out of the story, if nothing else. There's a lot of links between, just verbal links between that story and the Passover, and then that story and Leviticus 8 and 9, where the priests and the people are consecrated for Yahweh's appearance, and then also Leviticus 16, which is the Day of Atonement. So that really becomes this climactic moment where Isaac is associated with the consecration and the covering of the people at Passover, as well as, so at this point we've had an iteration of one of the elect brothers being associated with a sin offering, and that's Abel. We can talk about that one if you want to. And then next you have Shem, who has kind of an atoning connotation to him as he covers his father. And at this point you're thinking, well, that showed up in the narrative once or twice. That's kind of weird. Then you get to Isaac, and this happens where he's almost a post-Exodus climactic sacrifice. And so that should put into your head a little more. The elect one is associated with a sacrifice, and we'll see that again with Joseph. In this particular case, with it's a burnt offering in Genesis 22, but it's been these burnt offerings and sin offerings, which are atoning and communion sacrifices. And so that scene really is a climax, one of the climaxes in the two goats motif, and really begins to not only put the idea of the elect one is going to be an atoning sacrifice for the elect community, but it also puts the idea in your head of resurrection. And rabbis have been seeing that for a long time, as well as modern scholars, and Hebrews reads it that way. Abraham going up that mountain, the only way he can conclude that Yahweh is going to be faithful, well, the only conclusion he's make is Yahweh's about to prove himself a liar by killing the elect son. He's going to stop me before this happens, or he's going to raise him back from the dead. And we know the second option is what happens. But through that story, we begin to see, okay, maybe there's going to be someone who is sacrificed and rises again as an atoning firstborn elect son.
Interesting. So I've argued elsewhere, even on the podcast before, that about the Akedah scene that you're talking about. That
yeah.
And in my book, Entering Genesis, I talk about this a bit too.
I've just started that, by the way. I'm looking forward to getting into it.
Yeah. So in there, it's not as explicit as I've argued on here, but my view on that, I guess maybe again I'm maybe a minority of view on this, but I don't think God was telling Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. I believe he was telling him to consecrate or dedicate Isaac, but that for one reason or the other, because the word can mean consecrate or sacrifice, or dedicate or sacrifice. For one reason or the other.
Is it Olah in that location?
Say it again.
Is it Olah in that location?
Yes.
Okay.
That's right. And so I argue that that word is meant God. What God means by that is dedicate. Take your son up the mountain, dedicate him to me, consecrate him to me. But Abraham, because of the circumstance, understands, and I sort of see Abraham as like an impulsive guy, right? He acts on impulse a lot. And so you see it throughout his whole life. So, and in an act of impulsivity, and also just given his context, where you have other cults sacrificing children and things like that, he misunderstands the Olah from consecrate or dedicate to sacrifice. And so that's why when he takes Isaac up on the mountain, he's like, stop! He stops him.
Right.
And so and this, by the way, I argue too, was because after that, you never ever see Abraham and Sarah talk again. In fact, there's a wedge driven between them, and Sarah dies not too long after. I think of heartbreak. The fear like her husband was ready to murder her son that she had waited and waited and waited and waited for. I think there's some interesting relational and family dynamics there. But I love that story, and there's a wide variety of interpretations of it. But
there have been throughout the ages. So, and maybe once I get into the podcast a little more, you'll convince me otherwise. I think so. And that may be part of my my hermeneutic a little bit that leads me down a different path, is because I don't read so much for historicity. Not to say that it's not historical, but
sure.
I'm reading it as though, pretend the book is a novel. And it's someone is writing this out for artistic purposes, obviously theological as well. But the historical circumstances behind the story don't really matter to the actual narrative itself. That's just an assumption that I read with, that I think, given the artistry and the literary links and the motifs that run through it, it seems to me to be a more dependent on it's more of a self-referential narrative, and the gaps that you find in the narrative are there intentionally. And there are some places where we can fill in gaps, but it also can run us down straight paths.
Yeah,
but I can see what you mean about him being. Sorry, I see what you mean about him being impulsive.
A little bit of different starting points. That you and I would take. That's interesting to me. I think the historicity is important, and I think at least in certain Jewish circles, your approach would be more at home. I think, like very at home. I think it'd be very at home in certain Jewish circles. But I don't know. I think the history is important. But as I preached for about a year and a half through Genesis, a couple years back, right before I came into the Gospel of Mark, and I referred to it consistently, like from the beginning, as our family novel.
Yeah.
Like our family history, our family biography, or our family novel is the exact wording I used.
Yeah.
But,
well, and I think it's important too to think about the fact that the original audience of this, they're not wrestling with these categories about historical or not. They're like, no, this is our family history.
Right.
So the things that we're debating about, kind of, they're just, no, don't. It's our family history. Yeah, of course it's a history. So yeah, we may have different starting points, but I think they, at least reading this, would say, well, yeah, you're right. It is history.
Maybe we don't have different starting points even. Maybe we have a similar starting point or the same starting point, but sort of take different exit ramps and then get back on the same road here and there. But
I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think of a good analogy for that. But so just other stuff on Genesis. The story where they come off the ark, they get wasted. That's a crazy. The whole story of Genesis is hilarious. I mean, like from a comedic. I do stand up comedy. I don't know if you do that, but like like a comedic standpoint, like the story is hilarious. That here you have Noah. He's like been on this boat with his wife and kids like 40 days. It ends up being like what, 2 years or so. I don't know how long it is.
So he gets off and says, "I need a drink."
Time, to be on a boat with your wife and kids and a bunch of animals, and it's so funny to me, hilarious that the first thing he does, as soon as he can, like he gets off the boat and gets wasted, pretty much. Not that it's funny that people get wasted, but he's like, I gotta have a drink.
Yep. That's one of the places you could probably fill in the backstory.
Yeah. So just the family dynamics are incredible to me in Genesis. Like when I was preaching through that and teaching through that, and as I wrote the book, like the family dynamics, like, I don't really deal with the science stuff. The theology stuff is good. The history stuff is good. But for me, it was the family dynamics, the relationship that I was like dialed into mostly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a large part of the two goats thing, where there's that motif within that motif of the brotherly strife. Everybody's always in conflict, and then we have finally a couple of people who, when they're starting to be at the climax of their story, they start reconciling. They start making alliances and making friendships, making covenants. Right. And that really climaxes in Joseph, which we should talk about Joseph before we're done. But yeah, the Noah story. That's I'm curious. Do you look at how do you look at the seeing the nakedness of Noah? Because I know there's a few different popular.
You beat me to the punch. Seeing the nakedness of Noah, like I tend to lean toward that may well be the first act of rape and sodomy in the canon. So I'm curious about your take on that.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Though I think instead of sodomy, so in Leviticus 18 and I believe 21, there's the phrase, to look on to your father's nakedness is to have sex with your mother. Yes. And so I think that's what's going on here, especially since we see Reuben. He does this in Genesis 38, and it's why he gets passed over for the firstborn blessing in Genesis 49. We see this with, I think it was it's either Abimelech or Absalom in 2 Samuel 16, where he takes all of his father's concubines and sleeps with them on the roof of David's house to let everyone know that I'm the top dog now. And so I think Ham here was making a power grab by trying to take the matriarch of the family and saying, I'm the new patriarch, and my son Canaan, which that's how he got his son Canaan, is now going to be my firstborn, who's going to inherit the family, basically. And that's also why we see Noah. He doesn't say, cursed be Ham. He says, cursed be Canaan. Well, why would he curse his grandson? Like, well, that's because it's the child of his inbred rape of his wife. So to me, that makes the most sense. And there's some other interpretations out there, but that's where I lean towards.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
To me, too, let me add in there that it actually goes in step with that two goats motif, in that Ham, he doesn't explicitly wrong Shem, who becomes the chosen line here, but he does make that power grab and wrong him in that way. From there, we see down into Nimrod goes out and becomes the city builder who builds the hostile cities. So we kind of see Ham as the goat for Azazel, vicariously through Nimrod, whereas Shem's line goes to the goat for Yahweh line. And so it's a very brief story. We don't get all the details, but I think there's enough clues in there to tell us that's how these two lines are trying to divide.
Right. Yeah, I think so. And as you get from Genesis 9 to Genesis 10, that's an incredible, it's an incredible shift. And I think that's often really overlooked. The transition from Genesis 9 to 10, we sort of get to 11 and focus on that. But boy, that's we really got to stop and focus on chapter 9 and 10 as well.
There's some nuggets in that genealogy.
I'm curious. You mentioned we should talk about Joseph. Yeah, in the book that I wrote, I don't go easy on Joseph at the end.
Okay.
Like I think he in my sermons as a preacher, I think Joseph is responsible because you flip from Genesis to Exodus, right? And it's been 400 years. I think Joseph is the one responsible for essentially causing what would become the Exodus. Right? He enslaves. He's the one that, like, his actions ultimately lead to the enslavement of his people.
Yeah,
I don't know if you agree with that, but yeah, it's a fascinating story to me.
Well, I think it starts off with Joseph being, like you said, a very negative character. I mean, depending on how you translate that verse about he shepherded the flocks with his brothers, it could very easily, I think, is better translated as he was shepherding his brothers. So he's the younger brother, he's bossing them around, then he gets these dreams about, okay, I am the elect one. Guess what, guys? I'm going to roll over all of you, and he flaunts it. So really, the first few verses of his introduction, kid's a turd. He's horrible to his brothers. And so that's kind of the portrayal we're supposed to get. And he starts looking more like a Jacob character. Like, this guy's going to be the elect one, but he's horrible. We don't want him. And so that, because of that, if he weren't like that, he never would have went to Egypt. But along the lines of the pattern that we see, what happens is Joseph begins his exodus when his brothers, they exile him. What's really cool is with the two goats motif, he becomes both goats. So, and this has been recognized by even scholars like Karl Barth, Mary Douglas. This has been put together by a guy named Andrei Orlov in the Atoning Dyad. He kind of details out how this has been seen. And so whenever he is sent out, his brothers take a goat and slaughter that goat and dip his robe in the blood. That's the second time, or the third time we've heard the word blood in Genesis. The first time was whenever Abel was slaughtered. So there's some connections there as well. But anyway, he's associated with the goat for Yahweh through that act. He's associated with the goat for Azazel because basically the sin that his brothers committed on him caused his exile out of the land, out to the wilderness. So this may be a bit of a looser connection, but at least conceptually, he is bearing his brother's sins quite literally out into the wilderness and into no man's land, which becomes Egypt. Now, in the Exodus motif, he goes down into a pit. He's pushed down in the well and then brought back out. Well, throughout the biblical story in Psalms and Isaiah, the pit is a place of death. It's like Sheol. And so he goes into, sort of metaphorically, and there's other scholars who have noticed this, he comes back up and it's almost like a death and resurrection. Then he goes down into Egypt, which is literally death, and ends up as a slave there. He then again goes into another pit, a jail. So again, he comes back out of that. Right. And there's a lot of testing that goes on in this, a lot of things that go on in these narratives. They're very rich. But eventually he is brought up by Pharaoh, and he is, he's given a gold chain and given some white linens, or some good linens, which are the same words used to talk about the high priest's clothing and not used elsewhere. And so there he's made a high priestly figure. Obviously he's made a kingly figure, second in command in the whole land of Egypt. And so he's a priest king who's exalted. Pharaoh gives him a wife, just like Yahweh does to Adam. There's only one thing that he's not supposed to touch, just like they're not supposed to touch. Adam and Eve aren't supposed to touch the fruit. And we see that Joseph has previously passed the test of not touching the one thing with Potiphar's wife, because he says, like, there's one thing I'm not supposed to touch, and it's you. So now he is fit to inhabit that role that Adam was supposed to inhabit. So ultimately, Joseph, who becomes the goat for Yahweh and the goat for Azazel, he goes through an Exodus, he passes a test and becomes a priest king who is in Yahweh's service. And I should mention here that I go into this in the book, but Pharaoh in this story, not in Exodus, but in Genesis, literally plays the role of Yahweh for Joseph. And that kind of shows how Joseph is this new Adam figure. After that, some people have interpreted Joseph's actions towards his brothers very negatively. I think that he's doing an act of reconciliation. He is verifying their claims to be righteous when they tell him that. And when he verifies that, then he reconciles with them. So he becomes this elect figure who has been redeemed. He is now not only the sacrifice, the one who bears sins, the one who leads in Exodus. He is also the reconciler of his brothers. Then he becomes the savior of the nations, the provider of the nations, and really becomes this very clear picture of what is the seed of the woman going to look like. And then we know that, in Genesis 49, that picture passes on to Judah. But yeah, it just gives us such a clear picture of the hope that we have in Christ back in Genesis. And I think that the author has intended these literary motifs to point us in this direction. I'm not one who wants to find Jesus under every rock in the Old Testament and fall in that fallacy. And so I'm hoping that the details and the connections and the literary connections will bear out that, the author actually intended us to see this.
Yeah. Well, interesting. Man, it's fun talking about this. We could probably go on all day, but we'll start to wrap up here. I want to encourage those of you watching or listening again to go to Whip and Talk or Amazon and get a copy of Caleb's book and enjoy reading that. I believe there's a Kindle version as well.
There is, on Amazon.
Yeah, and so you can get a digital version or a print copy.
It's a bit of a nicer price as well.
Yeah. Also check out the Bible in Context. They have a YouTube channel, and we're posting their stuff on our podcast as well as the Glossa House TV channel. So the part of the Glossa House TV lineup and the Proof Text lineup as well. We're really excited about that. But man, Caleb, it's good to see you. Thanks for sharing. It sounds really interesting. I'll keep reading as I can, and hopefully this will get some other folks turned on to your project and your projects and, into what you're doing. So thanks for carving out some time to be here, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's as two Genesis scholars discuss things, we're going to have some places where we divert. And I love having that conversation and just learning from each other. So I appreciate it. And look forward to talking to you again soon.
Absolutely. Well, to all of y'all watching and listening, thanks so much. Check out glossahouse.com as well. And the Proof Tech podcast and the Glossa House TV channel on YouTube. It's really booming over there right now. So we're excited and thrilled about that. We're at the time of this recording, we're nearing 10,000 subscribers. I imagine once this airs, we'll probably be past that. So thanks to everyone for supporting us, and it's really fun to watch this grow. So Caleb, man, good to see you, and everyone else, thanks. We're gonna wrap up there, and we'll stop and say we hope that helps.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.